The guidebook that Joan referenced was part of a project for that we worked on with the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, and this guidebook is part of one of their newer projects, which is called Sexual Assault Through the Lifespan. And it's a program, it's a 5-year initiative aimed at helping service providers, folks such as law enforcement, advocates. We're getting some feedback from somebody who's got their microphone open. I'm not sure who that would be, but if you are aware that you might have your microphone open by accident, that'd be good. Anyways, the Sexual Assault Through the Lifespan is a 5-year initiative. It's designed to help service providers like law enforcement, advocates, health professionals, prosecutors, and anyone else who works with this population to reach out and serve survivors of all ages. The effort came from a recognition that people experience sexual violence at all ages. And it's really an acknowledgement that children, teens, adults, and women and men in later life all have unique needs that are different from one another. And this project is designed to help people working with those populations meet those people's needs. We know that sexual violence can impact a person at any point in their lives, from childhood through sexual abuse or to sexual violence in later life. And this project really tries to direct a trauma-informed approach to services. And it tries to look at the gaps in service delivery to see how they can address those gaps to serve those populations who may fall through the cracks in our systems. So they've done a lot of focused on a lot of different areas. In the first year, they focused on sexual violence in later life, and then the second year on child sexual abuse, then on sexual violence against teenagers, and in the last year of the project, they've been focused on sexual violence in adulthood. So it's really covered the full range of the lifespan. So now we'll tell you just a little bit about this particular project, the Family Reconnection and Reunification project that we've been working on.
Great. So this is, we thought that it might be helpful to just also begin with some definitions. But even before I do that, I just wanted to say that it really is, I think, very courageous for many people on the call to even take the time to look at this issue. And I think both Peter and I actually love wonderful and difficult conversations, so we're hoping that we can get some great questions coming forward. And if you have questions anywhere in this talk, just type them in and we'll try to get to them when we get to the Q&A part. But we want to just make it clear that that it's a process that you can stop at any point, and it's also not right for every family. So we thought we'd maybe start before definitions even talk about our values. And that first I'd say that we don't think that every family should go through a reunification process. There are families which don't have the resources where the person who abused doesn't take responsibility. So there's many reasons why not to do it. But we want to explore the times where it does make sense. Second, I also want to say equally that there are many families, as we know, that never report sexual abuse. The report's not substantiated, it remains unfounded, or there's no conviction. And so we hope that some of the tools that we'll talk about in the booklet may be helpful for people in terms of thinking if they're going to be in connection, how do they do that safely? In terms of the definitions that we're using, we're talking about family clarification, first and foremost, which is sort of a structured way to look at what happened and to acknowledge and discuss how a family will handle the harm and the abuse it's caused and the impact that it has on everyone. The second reconnection, family reconnection, is we think it's important. It's important to acknowledge that there really is often an urge for reconnection. That after the clarification process, that it's an opportunity to talk about maybe what form, if any, and might work for a particular family. And third, the reunification process is that if there is a possibility of doing that, it's an in-depth process where basically all the professionals involved with the family, with each of the family members, work together to consider the process based on what type and degree of contact might be possible between the family and the child who's been victimized, and also the child, the adolescent, or the adult who's sexually abused. So next slide there, Peter.
Okay. So why should I care? I mean, you've all come here because clearly you do have some interest in the topic, but really, you know, one of the things that was really striking for Joan and me when we were interviewing people about this is we talk about the topic of reunifying families where someone had sexually abused a child, and we were talking about the possibility of reunification and just what that process might look like, or that considering that process might look like. And very often the reaction was for the blood to run out of their face and for their face to go white. So there's a real resistance to that, to the whole notion. I think when a lot of us think about a child being sexually abused, the tendency immediately and understandably is to focus on the manipulation, the vulnerability, the betrayal, the long-term impacts of the trauma, the disruption to the families. And we will often just feel justifiable anger and outrage and a wish to protect and to punish and to create safety. So I think we all, many of us, operate on the assumption that when sexual abuse occurs, that act is so egregious and such a betrayal of trust that any wish that a child might have for connection with the person who abused them might be severed automatically. And while that may be absolutely the case in some situations, we'll see as we're moving through this that it's actually often more complicated than that. That reality is and relationships are a lot messier and more complex than we'd imagine that they are. I'm always struck in my 15 years as a frontline social worker at CPS, I saw lots of really painful family situations and removed lots of kids from their families. But I can honestly say I never met a child who didn't want to be with his or her family, just without the abusive circumstances. And even more surprisingly, I never met a parent who, once you got past the defensiveness and the shame, didn't in their heart of hearts want to be a good parent. So the reality that we're really facing and operating in every day, those of you who are working with families, is that, like it or not, and whether we ultimately support it or not, family members want connection. And one of the things that's really changed in the time since I stopped being in Child Protective Services is social media. Social media makes it much easier for people to connect with one another, whether we want them to or not. So that drive towards connection is going to be something that we really have to manage. And so planning really increases the ability to control that and monitor it, and even to get buy-in around it if it feels like it's a team effort, including the people that may want to have contact. And it's really then important that to understand that those supports increase safety and healthy outcomes in the long run. So that's really the answer to that question, is why should we care? Because it's a real drive that many people have. There are some important concerns, of course, that need to be addressed before it's even considered to reunify a family. And first and foremost would be the abusive person's ability to control their behaviors. Without that surety or confidence that that was something that person had really worked on and made some progress on, there's really no justification whatsoever for moving forward. The second piece would be the family's ability and their commitment to support and reinforce changes. And one of the real ways to being successful at that is if you can create an alliance with the family, as opposed to, as a Child Protective Services, I was often in a conflictual relationship with the families, and it really was a prescription when that happened. And when we weren't able to get by that, when they weren't able to get past their defensiveness, it was a real prescription for failure about instituting any long-term protective factors for the kids. You certainly want to assess and have the ability to assess the risk for victimization, re-victimization, and you want to hold the interests of the victimized child as top priority, first and foremost, in any discussion about whether this is a good idea to move forward with reunification. And the other really important piece, and I worked in a rural communities, and having supportive services and access to effective supportive services and resources before, during, and after reunification, if it in fact happens, is really critical to its success. So those are things that anybody who's even thinking about this really needs to consider. So another reason why it's important to care about this is because we're all impacted by it. What we know is that historically 1 in 4 girls, 1 in 6 boys have had some kind of unwanted or abusive sexual experience in childhood. We're all likely to know someone close to us, or perhaps we ourselves had a similar experience. So we carry those experiences in some form throughout our lives. But we know that the impact can vary depending on whether a child had support, whether they were accessible, and whether the individual felt safe enough to get the help. So those are things that we really need to address as we're thinking this through. But self-awareness is going to be really key for any provider who's working on this issue with folks, because we all come to this work with certain understandings, certain stereotypes, certain belief systems, and being aware of those is going to be really critical to success. And it's also important to know that fear is a real basis for a lot of the immobilization that we see in families, and that if we can make the families feel safe, we have a much greater opportunity to engage with them effectively. So then there are a lot of cultural considerations that really need to be taken into account when we're considering any kind of reunification. And, you know, in my child protective work, again, what I really constantly was reminded that there are multiple cultural influences in any family. In fact, I used to say that every family had its own unique culture, and it's made up of many different things, even though we all tend to lean towards identifying somebody according to a single identity, something that is visible, something like race, ethnicity, class, gender. But the reality is it's often more complicated and more of a blend of influences. And that's something that, again, it's really important. This is something we all know, but it's really critical that we as providers constantly remind ourselves of this. You know, a positive or negative history with services can have a really distinct effect on someone's engagement with services in the present. So if we use a trauma-informed approach, it's safe to assume that anyone with past experience about having outside services or outside intervention, even if it ultimately was positive, they may have had some traumatic elements. So it's important to remember that resistance is a normal self-protective mechanism. It's not necessarily an unwillingness to create a safe plan. It's just survival. And there's a great opportunity often once you start looking below the surface, because you can find that there are a lot of resources or skills or support options in their various communities that you might not be familiar with if you're not part of their cultural group. So there may be beliefs, family structure issues that can serve actually as a support mechanism for them. So it's really helpful to sort of dig in and find out what's going on in their families. And again, that self-awareness, if the people we're working with share characteristics with us, we may have assumptions about how, you know, people like us behave. So that leads to a potential for false assumptions or judgments, either positive or negative. Or we may have a stake in accentuating the otherness of this particular family or individual, to distance ourselves if we think that this is not something that we would ever, or people in our group would ever do. So, Joan, I think you're next.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Thank you, Peter. And maybe just building a little bit on what Peter said in terms of even the topic sometimes causing some panic or having people turn white. What we've found in terms of even talking about it, that key, I think, to the decision is really having also an understanding of what we know about the people who sexually abuse. So we thought we'd just take a minute to talk a little bit about, who are they, what is sort of assessment and treatment sort of in that world, and maybe why we also try to use person-first language as much as possible when we're doing this work. So maybe just to begin with, just to say, like, who are they? And I think, just as an exercise, if you wouldn't mind just taking a minute to type in, when I say that, the term sex offender, what are the words that come to mind? And if you could just type them into, the question action, that would be great. And I know for me, I grew up with the image of a dirty old man sort of lurking on the edge of our playground. And this is an exercise that I find is really helpful. This is the image that I think when you bring up the topic, people think of. So the words that are coming up right now are male, pedophile, white man, pervert. Someone doesn't actually use the word sex offender. Monster, adult man, bad people, boundary violator, loner, deceitful. I actually had a chance to be in Australia, and they said rock spider, which I'd never heard that term before. But teachers, adult men, narcissist, there could be siblings, somebody pending criminal charges. There's also sort of acknowledgments of child on child, a sinner, opportunist. So you can see these are the terms that I think that come to mind that people have. And I think that in some ways, certainly, I think some of that image may be changing a little bit. I think for the first time in the 25 years that I've been working in this field, I've been hearing something like, well, that could be my son. And I think some of the awareness that we've had around campus sexual assault is starting to maybe affect how people may think about this. And the reason that's important is that if we see sex offenders as monsters, then we won't see the actions or the abuse, in particular, of the people that we love most. So the image that people have of the sex offender is very important. And Peter, if you can go to move ahead to, I guess 2 slides, that would be great. I know that you're, sometimes there's a little bit of a delay here. So if you can go ahead and then 1 more slide. So if you think about that, maybe the image now of this kind of image, and what if when people were thinking about people who sexually abuse, and think about this being the image that comes to mind. There could be this boy, it could be the grandmother, it could be the father with his arm around the mother and daughter. But what if we start thinking about this as the image, then if we see something, if we see certain behaviors, people might feel more comfortable in saying something. And I think that's really, in terms of the having a family really be able to engage in this, really understanding that the image that they have of a sex offender may actually interfere with their ability to see the people that they love doing some things which are harmful, could be and could be abusive. So the next slide here. So what do we know about the people who sexually abuse? So we know that that in terms of statistics, that about 1/3 are within the family, and as we redefine family, that might grow as well. We know that 59% and even higher are known to the victim. I know I did some work in Vermont, and the number that was there is 97%. We have such a small state, people all know each other, so that number could be much higher. The majority are male, and I think what somebody said to child, that 30 to 50% of the people who sexually abuse children are children or teenagers as well. So when we think about who are they, I think it's important to think about then really the diversity and the wide diversity there is. Are we talking about a 12-year-old, or are we talking about a 50-year-old? Are we talking about what kind of behaviors? So in the next slide, we want to talk a little bit about the impact of treatment. And I often get the question of, does treatment work, for sex offenders? And to me, whenever I hear that question, it's sort of a red flag, because it's such a huge generalization to say that we want to think about, treatment for whom? Are we talking about a treatment for a child who's been sexually abused and acts out that abuse on another child? Or are we talking about a fixated pedophile in their 50s who is violent? So it's important to know when people say, does treatment work, is there a possibility for treatment, who are we talking about? And to do a comprehensive risk assessment on that person, and that will vary depending on lots of different factors. So in the next slide, so I think one of the things to remember when we talk about treatment, to talk about that, not to have a one-size-fits-all. To really look at the individual who needs to have treatment, and what are their strengths and what are their risk factors. We know that children and teens respond very well to treatment, and we also know that males who are sexually abused outside of the family have the highest recidivism rate. So again, this gives you a sense of why it's important to really look at the individual we're talking about, and not just think about it in terms of all sex offenders. Now, obviously, we could go into a lot more detail on this, but maybe we can revisit in our Q&A, but just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of why it's important to think about the diversity of those who might be in that family reunification process. So, Peter, back to you.
All right, if I can get this slide to move forward. So Joan mentioned person-first language, and it's something that can be very helpful, especially in a process where you're working at trying to reunify someone who's sexually abused a child in a family back into that family. And the beauty of person-first language, and I first learned it from folks in the community with people with disabilities. And the beauty of it is that it really avoids defining people solely by their experience or by a single characteristics that they have. So we found that there's a real value in applying that principle to the sexual violence field as well. Labels are handy, and I have to admit, person first is a little unwieldy, but it really can change the perspective of who the different people are that we're talking about when we're talking about re-engaging or reconnecting. Labels like perpetrator or abuser or even victim or even survivor, they can lock people into an identity. Now, people may want to use terms like survivor as an identity that they want to that they revel in for some period of time. But the beauty of person-first language is that you can talk about that experience of surviving sexual abuse. I'm a person who survived sexual abuse. It doesn't become the sole identity of who you are. It doesn't become your label of long-standing. I often hear people, and I have spoken myself about my abuser, and the problem with that for me is that it locks me into a relationship with an individual around an event that happened 40 years ago. And that's no longer my relationship. The person who abused me is what that person is. The fact that I was abused by that person is what is reality. But it's an experience. It's one of many qualities that each individual has. You've probably heard the difference between, people talk about the difference between shame and guilt. And the beauty of person-first language is it really allows for the possibility of growth and healing and developing new identities. So the difference between shame and guilt is that guilt is thought to focus on remorse or feelings about something someone has done, whereas shame would be a focus on their core identity. So a word like abuser or perpetrator would promote that notion of this is their core identity, this is who they are, whereas someone who has committed a sexual offense, someone who has abused a child, they can move on from that. They have the potential to address that issue, address that wrong, understand what was going on for them at the time, and try to change and control those impulses. So again, although it can be unwieldy, especially as you're first using it, it can actually have a very effective power to change how people think about the individuals involved in an incident of sexual abuse. So Joan, you want to talk about these?
Yes, absolutely. So just to let people know that for those people who sign, since you're on the call and you, on the webinar and you signed up for this webinar, we have your email list. So as soon as this guide is released, we'll certainly send you a notice about how to get a copy of it, and it will be for free. So I'm going to give a very quick overview of the 5 sort of possible steps that is outlined in the guide. And so the first one is to make sure that everybody gets treatment. So everybody in the family, and so that it's really important that, for example, that if it's a child or adolescent who has sexually abused another child in the family, that both of those children get treatment, and that also that's the family and the key support people in that family also are engaged in that treatment process. The second piece then would be an assessment of readiness, and this is where it's important to do the assessment of readiness both of the victim as well as the family, and in addition to also the abuser, the person who abused as well. So that if any of those people are not ready, so if, for example, the child who's been victimized is ready for reunification, but the child or the teen or the adult who abused them are not taking full responsibility, then that family may not be ready at that point, and they wouldn't necessarily go forward until it really is something that each of the professionals say, yes, there's something worthwhile, and would actually help with the health. And I'm doing really broad steps here, and I know I'm rushing through this a little bit, but again, a guide will give some more details here. The third part is a clarification, which I talked about earlier, and again, if somebody if the person who abused does not take full responsibility, then it's hard to move forward. It's hard to sort of think about a safety plan. So the clarification process is a chance for that to happen, but also for a chance for everybody in the family to make it really clear that it is not the victim's responsibility, and it's not the victim's fault. So that is a really important part of that clarification process. And when the first step is usually a letter, which is written by the person who abused, that letter doesn't go directly to the child who's been victimized. It first goes to that person's therapist, and then it goes to the child victim's therapist. So making sure that there's no language that might even inadvertently minimize what has happened or not claim full responsibility. So after the clarification process, then there's a safety planning, and this is where, depending on the kind of contact that's going to be explored, this is a chance where there really a safety plan can be put into place for everybody involved. And then again, if the family or the person who abused or the victim does not agree to the conditions, then it doesn't go forward. And finally, then, with all of those different steps, if those are all met, then reconnection and reunification is possible. So that's just a very brief sort of 5-step process. Again, the booklet is coming out through the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, and we will make sure you get that as well. And that this process, as we've outlined, sort of makes the assumption that the abuse has been reported, it's been substantiated, and that the person who abused is held responsible or convicted in some way. So when we say treatment for everyone, that's actually the key part in terms of a starting point here, although we acknowledge that most families don't get that far. So some of the tools, like around safety planning, might be actually helpful in this as well. So, Peter, just want to step into the guiding principles?
Sure. So there are some guiding principles for that process that Joan just described. That really would be applicable no matter what. Everyone brings a unique set of assumptions and principles. Now that's, there's going to be quite an array of professionals involved in all likelihood. Every member of the community deserves to be safe. We want to acknowledge the harm caused to everyone, not just the individual child who was abused, but to the family, to the extended family, to the community as a whole. Use of a trauma-informed approach, current best practices. Of course, do no further harm, and that's something that requires constant vigilance. A collaborative approach, and this is one of the things we'll talk about in a minute, with many different providers and services and family members involved, there's often some conflict about what people's perspectives are, and the best way to move forward on this effectively and safely is if we can develop a collaborative approach to it. Make sure that interventions are culturally informed and strength-based, and that everything we do increases the protective factors for the child and for the family as a whole. So, who's going to be at the table? Now, hopefully, as we populate this, your role will show up. If not, I apologize in advance. But there's a lot of different possible players at the table. And each one is going to have their own perspective, their own role based on their experience. Some are going to be constantly visible. They're going to be in the interaction, in the interplay on a regular basis. And some are going to be behind the scenes and have very powerful influence, but aren't going to be a regular contributor, but they're going to be, or a visible contributor. So the challenge here is to understand each of these people has the child's best interest in mind. And they each have a perspective that believes that their view and their approach is probably the most effective and the best for the child. But unfortunately, I think anybody who's ever attempted any of this work will agree that there's likely to be differences of opinion, differences of priority, differences of perspective. And that often leads to conflict and a belief that the other person just doesn't get it. So one of the real challenges that we all face in doing this work is to understand what vision is driving every person at the table, and to try to figure out what's the foundation of that vision, and to really think about how it might be in the best interest of the child to pursue that vision. So I'm a trained mediator, so one of the things that we learned early on in mediation was to try to identify interests as opposed to positions. So if you're involved in this work, thinking about the other people that are sitting at the table and what their interests might be, and try to understand what your interests are and how they relate to the other players at the table, and how they might be different from the position you're taking, and how your interests or their interests might be met in ways other than the position and the stance that someone has taken in a particular exchange or conflict. Looking at what are their strengths, how can those strengths be corralled somehow to further the best interests of the child? And what are the points of potential alliance and potential conflict? What needs are at stake for each of the people at the table? And again, there's an assumption, and we often lose sight of it when things get very charged and very emotional around something as evocative and triggering as childhood sexual abuse. So what's going on for other folks? What needs are at stake? How might they be met safely? And what actions are being triggered for each of us? What feelings and emotions and beliefs and experiences from other situations are we bringing to the table when we come? So it's a really important part of this whole process for everybody to be very self-aware of of what experiences, what attitudes, what beliefs they're bringing to the table, and to try to understand the others who are at the table. So, I think we're at a point now where we'd be open to...
Yeah, Peter, I wanted to jump in and just say we have tons of questions coming in, so thanks everybody. I think we easily, I think Peter and I are doing actually a full day training on this, and we sort of laughed about how we're going to try to squeeze a full day into 30 minutes, and I think I see why that's so difficult, because there's some great questions here, and I'm not sure we'll get to all of them, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. And I think that one of the key questions that's popped up a couple times, Peter, that maybe you can start with is that the question about the role of the victim as sort of guide to the decision making on reunification. And I know that we've had some conversations about that. So if you want to start that responding to that question.
Yeah, I mean that's clearly the most complicated and has to be the highest priority. What the child who's been victimized is wanting and feeling, and what's in their best interest, and that's going to sort of how much control over that process that child is to be given is going to certainly be determined by their emotional state, by interaction and consultation with their therapist, what their age is. I mean, you certainly are going to have a different, they're going to have a different role for someone who's 5 than someone who's 17, and is talking about bringing somebody back into the household who had been abusive toward them. It certainly would be the case that they would need to have a veto power somehow. They need to have that absolute control of, if they're not ready for that, they would certainly need to have that ability to set that limit. But that can be complicated because, as we know, nobody is 100%. I mean, everybody's ambivalent about most everything. So, there might be a 90-10 wish for somebody to come back, or a 10-90 wish for somebody to come back. And they may not have the same opinion and belief and need as other members of the family. So protecting that child and making sure that that child has a full say in. Now, the other side of that question is if the child wants the person to come back and everybody else feels like this is not ready to happen. And so in that circumstances, the whole family and the safety of the whole family is at risk. And I guess that, it's true that has to be taken into consideration for both positions that the child might have. But it's never a simple answer. There are lots of different factors that would have to go into making this decision, and it could change over time. So I don't know, Joan, if you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think the complexity, I think your answer sort of reveals a lot of the complexity of this in terms of developmentally where that child who's been victimized is, what their age is, what the family's reaction to it has been. Is the child in any way being blamed for the breakup and getting pressured into the reunification? I think that one of the reasons why having the child have a treatment provider who can be part of that process means that they're not that their opinion is it's not them who needs to say I'm not ready and I need to stop. So I think that one of the questions that which might tie into the next thing is like one of the couple people I've asked, like what happens if either the victim has sort of like one case that someone suggested is that the victim withdrew from their treatment but wants reunification, and another one said what if the counselor, the treatment provider for the child who's been victimized, said it may do more harm than good because maybe of the child's age. And so one of the questions comes forward that what happens when there's not a treatment provider, for that that child has been victimized. And one of the important responses here is that that there are other people who may be providing treatment for the family, so that the child has been victimized, even if they're no longer directly in treatment, that that the process going forward would have some sort of treatment provider who is providing help for the entire family through that decision process. Again, assuming this is a situation that has gone through, and the person who abused has been convicted. So I'm wondering if you want to answer some of that question as well, Peter, about what happens when either the victim no longer wants treatment, or is maybe too young to really benefit from treatment at that point in their life.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is wondering whether the child would be willing to see someone else. I mean, I think we all know that not everyone is the right treatment provider for a particular individual, so it may be that, fresh eyes would be acceptable to a child. And again, so much depends on developmental stage and age. At some point, certainly at a young enough age, the decisions just have to be made based on what's in the best interest of the child, certainly taking into account the child's wishes. But I think the likelihood of success, if there isn't a mechanism in place for the child to work out whatever feelings comes up as that process unfolds, that it feels to me like a setup. Now, the reality is that the courts often order a reunification in a time frame when people don't necessarily feel like it's a good idea, or there isn't a consensus about that. And that's something you are sort of in a position where you have to make the most of what you've got, try to provide the greatest level of resources. Some kind of wraparound system would probably be very useful and effective. But again, this is assuming that all these resources are available and accessible to the family. But really, the more supports the family has, the safer and the more quickly the process can unfold. So I guess my first thought would be, if the child is completely unwilling to engage in some kind of treatment, that it's probably not a good time to move the reunification forward.
Yeah. And Lindsay Fleischman sort of just jumped in and said, it's a good point, and so that and maybe we can really emphasize the point that the process may be actually more successful when you have multiple therapists sort of aiding in the process.
Mm-hmm.
Another I thought great question was that someone asked about, are there different treatment approaches for different cultures? And do you want me to start with that one, Peter?
Yes.
Yeah, sure. So partly maybe jumping in because I wanted to say that there's actually, if people are interested, the Prevent Connect is having a webinar coming up, and particularly what the sort of community responses can be within tribal communities in the U.S. And I just really had the chance recently to meet with some. I was in New Zealand, and I had a chance to meet with some clinicians who work with Maori, who are Maori, in New Zealand, and I was just so impressed with the way that they took sort of what I would say is sort of research-based treatment methods here that we would accept here in the U.S. for sure, but that they wrapped that within their cultural traditions. So that treatment began with actually, rather than sort of having these individualized, treatments, sessions, they certainly had the individualized session, but then the first session was a weekend retreat, and it was at the a traditional house, and that the elder woman involved would need to sing the invitation to the person, basically the person who committed the sex offense, to invite them into the traditional house. And by doing that, I thought it was just like an immensely radical way of sort of saying that, we're respecting who you are, and we're inviting you as well as your family and your ancestors. But what also I thought was very radical was that by accepting an invitation, and you had to specifically accept it, that you were also accepting responsibility for what you did. So there are different, those are sort of just maybe two different cultural examples where I think a lot of the same, research that we use is valid within any cultural context, but that how that then is wrapped so that it actually addresses some of the cultural considerations is so essential, because as Peter mentioned earlier, that certainly every culture is different, but every family has a culture as well. And part of what the therapist or the team of therapists have to do is really listen to those cultural norms and make sure that they enhance safety as opposed to maybe prevent that.
Yeah, and I wouldn't add a whole lot to that other than just that self-awareness, again, about what our assumptions are, what our beliefs about, especially if it's actually even whether it's a culture that we identify with or not, that it may not be the case that what would work for us would necessarily work for an individual in a particular family or a particular family as a whole. And just being aware of those differences and being conscious of trying to eke out what their norms are and what might be useful to them in terms of their cultural and individual norms and beliefs and practice. So
another question that came through was, what are some questions that that going into family reunification that a therapist might want to consider? I don't know if you want to try taking that one first, Peter.
Sure. Well, I think first of all, where the identifying both where the child has been victimized and the person who committed the abuse, kind of where they are in their treatment process is really critical first step. So assessing whether there's a readiness on both of their parts, and then a readiness on the family's part, because the family is going to play a really critical role in kind of normalizing a new relationship between those two individuals and between the family and each of those individuals. So I've supervised many a visit, and I've advised families on supervising visits, and it's a surprisingly difficult task because there's this real balance between sort of exerting an external force, an external authority, and trying to normalize the interactions, trying to make the interactions safe and not seem too stilted. And the best way that I've often found to accomplish that is to get everybody working off the same page. If the supervision, if the process is seen as an external sort of authoritative, punitive force, the likelihood of the cooperation or the likelihood of some resistance is affected. So to the extent that everybody can see this process as safety for everyone, including the person who's engaged in abusive behavior, that person is really important to get buy-in from. And it makes getting buy-in from the family around establishing firm boundaries and maintaining those and supervising whatever contact there is between the individuals, it can make it a lot easier. But without that, it really it really becomes a challenge for folks. They feel like every limit they set is an accusation, and that's what you really want to sort of help educate the family about, that those feelings are going to be real, they're going to happen, and that this is going to be a long process, and that there may be some times when they have to say, no, we got to stop here, we got to regroup, we got to rethink this. So I think normalizing the fact that it's going to be difficult is really important. I don't know if that really answers the question, but
yeah, no, I think that's great. I think maybe the few quick things I would add to that is also just we often think about when we're looking at the trauma of sexual abuse, we sometimes forget to look at the strengths of the family as well. And that's a really key part of the process, to make sure that the strengths of each member of the family is sort of brought to the table, so that it really is an opportunity to build on what's possible. Also look at maybe what resources there are outside the family, not just within the family, but outside the family that can be brought to bear. And last, I would say that, just building on what you were saying about boundary setting, but also to make sure that the family has the skills to confront behaviors when maybe those boundaries are being pushed up against a little bit too much. And so that if a boundary is being set with a family safety plan, does everybody in the family feel comfortable saying, we agreed to X, and we're seeing that you're actually not following X. So do people have the ability to actually say that? So we said that, that we agreed that we would respect, closed doors at all times, or that we agreed that except for the bathroom, all doors must remain open, but we're seeing your doors closed. Do they feel comfortable reminding people of what the family safety plan is and their boundaries? So those are all part of, I know this is very quick, and unfortunately, we're just at the top of the hour. So we very, what I would say is that we have a lot more questions to hear. Certainly, I think the booklet will answer some of these questions, and also if you want to go forward a little bit, we have, I think, our contact information in here as well as other resources. So if you can just go forward on the slides a little bit, I think we'll see that. In fact, that what we have is in the slide deck, which you can download from the Neary Press website, you'll see some additional resources that are listed here, and that in particular, like there's some that both CSOM, the Center for Sex Offender Management, and here the Resources for Resolving Violence also have wonderful information about family reunification. We also can see the references that we quoted on the slides themselves. So, excuse me. So those are there as well. Then also you'll see at the end is like how to contact us, Peter, or me, and then also just want to just maybe to end here to say that the next Neary Press webinar will be an overview of juvenile risk assessment. Maybe you can go into the next slide, Peter. And that will be with Dr. Phil Rich. And that's it's actually a series that there is the first time we'll be charging for the series. That's really in-depth to get CE credits as well, or that they're available to apply for, not included in the price, but they're on May 10th, 17th, and 24th. Also coming up is the another some offline training that are happening in Albany, New York, on contemporary practice in the treatment of sexually abusive youth, and also the assessment of juvenile sexual risk, also by Phil Rich. When you're on the Neary Press list, if you go to the next slide, that you've signed up for this webinar, that you also will be getting the Neary Press free newsletter. And this is actually a one-page newsletter. Our idea is to be short enough to read over a cup of coffee, that takes some of the most current research and puts that into something which is easy enough for you to read, and so you can stay current with some of the issues, particularly we focus on kids with sexual behavior problems. Then to say that the next free webinar that we're doing is with Jill Stinson, which is talking about treating adult sex offenders. That's also free. And last, I want to say the only reason we can do these is that we do have sponsors, sort of like NPR. I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors here, the Center for Clinical and Forensic Services, the Crime Prevention Branch, the Family Life Counseling and Psychiatric Services, Jarena Associates, Gippsland Center Against Sexual Assault, the Houston Transitions to Wellness and Counseling, Leo A. Hoffman Center, the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health, the Morrison Child and Family Services, New Hope Treatment Centers, the Ramsey County Corrections, St. Mary's Home for Children, Yarrow Counseling, and the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. And also last to say that you can become a sponsor, that the next page, if you, it's $98 for individuals and $250 for organizations. You're guaranteed a seat at the table for every webinar. I know this one was sold out, so if you did not register early, you would not have gotten in. You have access to CE credits, and you also get 2 newly pressed books. We believe this is really a nice win-win situation for everyone. So please help support us. Sign up for to be a sponsor. And last, I want to really say that it's been a pleasure, Peter, to do this with you. So thank you so much. And thanks, Tim, for your first round as our technical host. And thanks, everybody, so much for participating. We really appreciate it. It's been great.
Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate having you with us and your interest in the topic, which is a complicated and important one. So thank you.
Thank you. And please remember to sign out so that you can get the feedback form as well. Thanks very much, everyone, and I hope to see you next month. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.